Hello. Sorry we were a bit late. In fact, I didn't even pay for my parking because there was a line. But I do blame Professor Watson for having more to drink at dinner. And so that promises probably for an interesting speech. So welcome to the 8th Annual Constitution Day celebration, sponsored by the American Founding Initiative. The American Founding Initiative is sponsored by external sources. That is, it does not come from student fees or tuition or anything like that. This year's Constitution Day, we thank the Murdoch Foundation for sponsoring this year's Constitution Day. The Murdoch Foundation is a Northwest outfit interested in maintaining the study of great ideas on our college campuses. It is notable that funding for such matters usually comes from outside our universities these days. Yesterday, Boise State acknowledged the importance of such events in its communication to the general public. And we at the American Founding Initiative do thank Boise State for allowing us to have a room to sponsor this event and for allowing me to raise the money to support it. Tonight's speaker is Professor Bradley Watson of St. Vincent College in lovely Latrobe, Pennsylvania, home of Arnold Palmer, where he holds the Philip M. McKenna Chair in American and Western Political Thought. Arnold Palmer's dead, by the way, so not home, but like final kind of home thing. He also runs a wonderful program called the Center for Political and Economic Thought, a speaker series at St. Vincent's where I have been privileged to speak when I was finishing my first book. I did thank Brad in my introduction because his invitation came at a very opportune time as I was writing the book's introduction. His invite helped me to think through why I had done what I had done in my book. Brad has been on a Northwest speaking tour, spreading the gospel to far-flung places like George Fox University and yesterday at the University of Alaska. He has arrived at Boise State today to be our Constitution Day speaker. Brad is the author of a fine book, more than a decade old, entitled Living Constitution, Dying Faith, Progressivism and the New Science of Jurisprudence. His talk is entitled The Progressive Revolution in Jurisprudence. He will speak for about 45 minutes and then he will take questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bradley Watson.
Thanks very much, Scott. A very great pleasure to be here in this region, beautiful Boise, which I've never been to before, actually. I've been to Idaho, but I've somehow missed Boise, and this is a region of the country, the Northwest, that I love very much. I've lived away from it for 20 years or so, but I'm very grateful to Scott Yenner for having me here. He mentioned that my hometown, Latrobe, is the home of Arnold Palmer, which is true. He lived there, eventually died there, but it's famous for other things too. It's and if you learn nothing else from me tonight, which is quite possible, learn this. Latrobe is the home, the place of invention of, anyone know? A delicious dessert concoction invented in Latrobe, Pennsylvania? The banana split. This is an actual question. Do you remember the old board game Trivial Pursuit with the cards? You ever played Trivial Pursuit? It's an actual question. And I think it's Arts and Leisure or something. What delicious dessert concoction or something like that was invented in Latrobe, Pennsylvania? Now you know the answer to that. Thanks to coming here tonight. It's also the boyhood home of Mr. Rogers. His house, which the old-timers in town still refer to as the Rogers house, is right around the corner from mine. I literally live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. It's a true story. Also the home, most of my friends know it, the historic home of Rolling Rock Beer, brewed in the glass line tanks of Old Latrobe. So it's famous for many things. And of course, if the only team you should care about in the NFL, the Pittsburgh Steelers summer training camp is on the St. Vincent campus. So these are our claims to fame. My plan tonight is to speak, as Scott mentioned, for only, what did you give me, 3.5 hours, 4 hours? I hope to leave some time for questions after that. I will give this, there's going to be a present for the student who asks the best question afterwards. I will be the sole arbiter of who asks the best question, and there's no appealing for my judgments, but you will get a copy of the beautiful Center for Political and Economic Thought pocket constitution, better than any other pocket constitution in the land. It's printed on parchment. It has supplementary documents. It's a beautiful thing. And you can carry it around with you in the event of constitutional emergency, of which we have many in this country all the time. In fact, you can holster it and draw it on short notice in the event of such an emergency. So it's a little bigger than the average pocket constitution, but as I like to say, friends of our center need deep pockets anyway, so it fits in those. So, but you can win this, all right? 2016, we witnessed a rather interesting presidential election cycle, and we have a rather interesting president. Has anyone noticed this? Have you guys noticed this? Kind of interesting. A recurring theme and concern of that election cycle, both the primaries and the general election, was the kind of justice that the next president would appoint to the Supreme Court, right, and other federal courts, but especially the Supreme Court, because a seat had been vacated by the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. And from both sides of the political aisle and from organized interest groups came various breathless pronouncements. And I, worry and concern about the end of the republic as we know it. I expect this is going to be true of the upcoming election cycle, too. Judicial appointments are going to be a central concern. The president, by the way, has already done a few controversial things. Have you noticed some of these things? Much of the controversy, I would say, though, has swirled around relatively transient questions like executive actions and, shall we say, matters of personal style and manners, right? The long-term impact of those things is as yet opaque. By contrast, the main action that the president has taken, that everyone, left and right, agrees is destined to have long-term constitutional impact, is his appointment of new justices to the Supreme Court in particular, and the federal courts more broadly, right? Everyone on both sides realizes this has long-term impact. Before then nominee Neil Gorsuch even had a chance to say a substantive word in public about the kind of justice he would be, he was already controversial, explosively so. Scholars, politicians, political activists, they all weighed in. Wagons were circled, money was raised to support or oppose his nomination, and well, as for Brett Kavanaugh, remember the Justice Kavanaugh confirmation hearings? Where do I even begin to unpack what went on there? And if you think all this was bad, wait for the next nomination to the Supreme Court when, if President Trump is the one making the appointment, the balance of the court might be even more decisively affected if, as seems likely, progressive justice is the one who leaves the court, right? Hold on to your seats for that confirmation hearing. It'll be a highly televised, highly publicized showdown, epic melodrama, epic morality play. I would contend that it's a rather sad state of constitutional affairs that we must have such conniption fits whenever a justice of the Supreme Court resigns, retires, dies, right? We do, because we all know that the courts don't just interpret, but in fact make the law. So let me begin with a provocation. The fact that almost everyone, left and right, sees so much of the future of our constitutional republic hinging on one member of the Supreme Court, and I think you'd be foolish not to see it, demonstrates what constitutional originalists have been saying for a very long time. The court is far too powerful for anyone's good. Showing how and why this came to be the case, that's the burden of my argument here tonight. I've set myself the task of speaking to you about the progressive revolution in constitutional jurisprudence. And the way I want to approach this topic is first to articulate the origins of the phrase living constitution. You might have heard of that phrase, living constitution or living constitutionalism. The origins of this phrase in American progressivism, intellectual progressivism, which was a broad and deep movement that came to define elite opinion in the United States from the end of the 19th century through the 20th century. And second, and sort of in the course of doing this, I'm going to show the radical theoretical break of progressivism, and hence of living constitutionalism, with the founders' Constitution. The break stems, in brief, from progressivism's denial of the possibility of eternal verities, of truths that do not change with time and place, and the belief in such truths animated the thinking of America's founders, thus dividing them very sharply from the progressives who would come to be the dominant arbiters of constitutional meaning about a century after the founding. And finally, I want to show the enduring implications of living constitutionalism, of this progressive jurisprudence on America, on American courts, on American jurisprudence. In other words, I want to show where the rubber meets the road, right? Not just a high-level theoretical talk, but show how these things have actual impact. And I'm not primarily going to recount the many ways in which I think the U.S. Supreme Court has gone wrong, has erred in its pronouncements. Such recountings are ubiquitous and luminous even. Rather, I want to offer a kind of intellectual history of, a roadmap to, an intellectual archaeology, if you will, of American constitutionalism and contemporary American jurisprudence in particular. So the story I'm going to tell you tonight is a story partly about the development of moral, political, and legal thought in America, but also about an American legal culture in the grip of what I claim to be a radical revolutionary passion to be in the vanguard of what it sees as historical evolutionary unfolding, right? To be at the cutting edge of where it sees history is going. It's a process that seemed to be largely spontaneous and inevitable, but one that nonetheless occasionally needs some help from its judicial friends in order to be all that it can be. So I'll begin with a story within my story. It's a story about law, but particularly about lawyers and legal culture. Some of you might have heard it. Is anyone planning to go to law school here in that room tonight? I figured I usually get a few students there who are thinking about law school. You will appreciate this story. It happened right here in the greater Boise area, not too far from this spot, strangely enough. A tourist one day goes into a little antique store off all the beaten tourist paths, a mysterious looking place out on the edges of the city. And in this little shop, which was filled with statuary, the tourist notices a beautifully rendered life-size bronze statuette of a rat. Well, so he asks the old shopkeeper for the price of the rat. The shopkeeper was a Boise guy. What do you call Boise guys? Boiseans? Boiseans? Is that right?
Sure, that's what they go with. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. He was a Boisean from way back, before potatoes were even famous. I mean, it was a long time ago. I actually think it's worth thinking about state mottos to understand America, because somewhere between famous potatoes and live free or die, the truth lies. Think about this. Sic semper, tuber, I'm trying to think of the Latin word for potato, tubercum, or something like that. Anyway, the tourist asks for the rat's price, to which the shopkeeper gives his wheezy, barely audible reply. The rat will cost you $9.97, but the story behind it is going to be another $1,000. Tourist quickly says, "Keep your story, old man. I'll take the rat." So the tourist, quickly leaves the store with his newly acquired statuette tucked under his arm, and no sooner does he cross on the street in front of it than he notices 2 rats come up from a sewer grate and follow him. Then 2 more, then 10 more, then 100 from every manhole, ditch, abandoned building in the area, north, south, east, west. They came from as far away as Spokane. In fact, Boise residents subsequently said they all came from Spokane, because that's the kind of place Spokane is compared to Boise. Anyway, the tourist gets very disconcerted by this, and he drives his car several blocks, then several blocks more than a mile. Finally, over to Ann Morrison Park. I'm a little directionally challenged. I don't know which direction that is, but to his amazement, the rats follow the car, one by one, then thousands and thousands of them. And he gets out of the car and starts to run. And he sees some elevated platform, rock or table or something close to the river, jumps on top of the table, and he hurls this bronze rat into the river, lands it, sort of in the middle of the river. And all of these rats, thousands of them, promptly follow the statuette into the river and drown. Well, he climbs down, gets back into his car, immediately heads back to the antique shop. To which the wise and patient old Boisean that he was simply smiles and says, "Aha, I'll bet you've come back for the story." To which the tourist says, No, I came back to see if you have a bronze statuette of a lawyer. Well, that's it. That's all I have for you tonight. I think we have time for questions. The point of this joke, culturally suggestive joke, I think, is that it so captures America's disdain for the legal profession, which some of you actually want to go into. I'm a reformed lawyer turned political scientist, so this is, it's okay for me to tell stories like this. It's just self-loathing. So captures this disdain. I think there's another point, too. The tourist in the story wants immediate results. He's interested in... You missed the joke. I mean, if you're coming in now, like, it's all downhill from here. I mean, there's no... you're going to be very disappointed. He wants immediate results, right? The tourist is interested in things and their purely utilitarian character. If there's a statue that's going to get rid of lawyers, he wants that statue, and he wants it now. He doesn't have the time, the patience, the wisdom to wait for the story behind things. And I think, with some irony, one might suggest that vis-a-vis important political and moral questions, American lawyers and judges, because lawyers become judges, are themselves akin to the impatient tourist, the very disdain that Americans hold for lawyers and judges, who, according to Alexander Hamilton in The Federalist, if you read The Federalist, the judicial branch forms the least dangerous branch of government, but nonetheless, we think it's problematic because of lawyers and judges' impatience with what Americans, as citizens, consider to be politics. Americans' disdain might be related in some way to what they perceive as the legalistic desire of the legal culture to get immediate results, regardless of the expressed wishes of the people. How do they do this? They try to constitutionalize every apparently political or moral claim they can get their hands on, right? Create a new constitutional right to support some position. It's no secret, I think, that the least dangerous branch of government has become the locus of attention when we speak of the so-called culture wars that continue to rage in America. The least dangerous branch, far from being the weakest branch of government, has in fact become the strongest when it comes to the cultural directions of our constitutional republic. Well, I want to suggest that modern judicial activism is a stepchild of late 19th, early 20th century political thought, of this progressive political thought that I laid out at the beginning, which has transformed the weakest branch into the strongest branch, and in doing that, I also want to claim that progressivism has in fact directly undermined the rule of law. What do I mean by the rule of law? What do I mean by progressivism? The first question I think I can answer fairly briefly. The second, on the nature of progressivism, will take me a little more time. The rule of law in liberal democracies involves the invocation and enforcement of norms, rules by the state that are authoritative and that are consensually and publicly adopted, and they bind equally state and non-state actors. And these norms or rules have as their end the protection of the fundamental, the timeless natural rights of human beings. Thus, the rule of law cannot just be the rule of men, right? Just the rule of individual men. Cannot stem from the posting of norms in a manner such that they can't be known, and it cannot involve the alteration of norms in a contingent or non-consensual manner. By contrast, the now common notion, and you'll see this defended in scholarly literature and defended in effect by oftentimes a working majority of the U.S. Supreme Court, the now common notion that the Constitution itself is a living document, creating an organic legal order that's subject to what? Ceaseless change, growth, alteration by the least Republican branch of government, by the courts. This is incompatible with the idea and implementation of the rule of law, as I've just defined it. You can't square this with the rule of law. It's also the source of our seemingly ceaseless worries about who is appointed to this least Republican branch of government. That's why we have these explosive controversies. The living Constitution metaphor is the product of a great transformation that occurs in American political thought, which continues to have enormous effects on jurisprudence. And I'll just summarize this transformation as a move away from the earlier constitutionalism of fixed principles, cognizable words, institutional mandates, limits on power, to an organic or progressive constitutionalism in which the very notion of fixity or constitutional principles that don't change with time gets thrown out, right? It's something that has to be overcome by the living Constitution. Under this view, the exact nature, the degree of change or growth in the constitutional order is to be dictated by judicial elites in accordance with their perceptions of new realities that the progress of history imposes on constitutional interpretation. So this jurisprudential progressivism, if you will, relies on a theory of history with a capital H. Not just history as it's usually understood, looking backward, history as a record of events from which we might learn something, but instead a history that looks forward rather than backward, right, to hope and change upon change. A history that's alleged to keep unfolding in a steadily ever more egalitarian direction, but which needs, as I said, help from its judicial friends, right, to keep history moving forward, to keep clearing away blockages, to keep changing the Constitution, right, to allow this forward movement of history. The view is not simply, in other words, that we have of necessity an interpretable Constitution, but one that has to be interpreted in light of a particular theory of history. the contingent nature of the state, the individual, society, constitutionalism itself. This understanding is in a considerable amount of tension, even on the surface, with the rule of law and also the earlier American constitutionalism, the constitutionalism of the founders, that attempted to enshrine the rule of law through the creation of a constitutional order of what? Limited and dispersed powers serving the laws of nature and nature's God, things that do not change with time. The high watermark of this earlier constitutionalism, I would suggest, that is to say the pre-progressive constitutionalism, can be seen in the rhetoric of Abraham Lincoln, for whom Americans were, and I quote, the legal inheritors of the fundamental blessings bequeathed by the founders, whose principles, whose institutions, whose very names we have a duty to preserve, not just because they're old or useful, but because they're true. True because they're in conformity, Lincoln says, with the cause of civil liberty, of natural rights. They must shine on, again quoting Lincoln, in naked, deathless splendor. For Lincoln, to solve the constitutional problems of his day required looking backward rather than forward, to the founders, to the permanent things. For him, history is not destined to unfold in a democratic direction. Democracy itself, because of its indissoluble link with the passions rather than reason, is always combustible. Furthermore, there are certain fixed principles beyond which progress is impossible. I think Lincoln shared with Plato and Aristotle the belief that, those political philosophy students in the room, the belief that negative regime change is always a possibility. In fact, maybe more likely than positive regime change. And he was very wary of the notion of progress. Progress, evolution, growth were not part of his political vocabulary. Modern constitutionalism, by contrast, largely judicial interpretation and construction, tend to reject, as I've said, the idea that law, whether constitutional law or common law, can be an embodiment of eternal verities, right? And the proximate reason for this, again, in America, is the growth of progressivism. Now, the origins of progressive political thought come largely from two strains of thinking, which coalesce by the early 20th century into this thing which comes to be known as progressivism. These two strains are I view them as sort of twin doctrines, social Darwinism on the one hand and pragmatism on the other hand, the origins of intellectual progressivism in these things. Both of these doctrines, Darwinism, pragmatism, fully adopt the concepts of organism, environment, adaptation, the language of naturalism. At the end of the 19th century, what does everyone want to do? Social scientists, historians, political scientists, legal thinkers, they want to hitch their wagon to the scientific star, right? Everyone wants to the idea that natural science really rules the day. So we'll figure out a way to apply Darwin to politics and, pragmatic, evolutionary, experimental ideas to politics, right? And obviously these things seem in tension with fixity, right? Constitutional fixity. Let me give you something from a leading progressive philosopher named John Dewey. Some of you might have heard of Dewey or read Dewey. I'll give you a direct quote from him now. He says this: the influence of Darwin upon philosophy, and he might as well have said jurisprudence, resides in his having conquered the phenomena of life for the principle of transition, and thereby freed the new logic for application to mind and morals and life. Darwin becomes a kind of all-purpose tool for reinterpreting even political institute, not just a biologist, in other words, but a kind of political scientist, if you will, for the social Darwinists, right? And again, as I've said, the sort of merger, the overlapping merger of pragmatism and Darwinism leads to 20th century progressivism. And in a way, you can think of 20th century progressivism as a politicization, if you will, of these underlying philosophic doctrines, right? The use of these doctrines for political purposes, and therefore always looking forward to the next evolutionary change rather than backward. Intelligent guidance, endless socio-political reform are always possible because no problem is understood to be an inherent facet of human nature. And that alone is sufficient to distinguish this new understanding, the Darwinian understanding of political science, from the political science of the Federalist Papers, right? The founders' political science. What works pragmatically should be given a chance to prove itself, divorced from any sense of constitutional constraint. And by the late 19th century in America, when progressivism was born, the old understanding of the nature and permanent limits of politics is dying. The idea that politics, political institutions have permanent limits is dying. And this death is linked to these intellectual movements. The Darwinian model, as I say, comes to be seen as some kind of all-purpose explanatory tool that can be applied to the natural sciences. And you get this potent intellectual cocktail of progressivism growing out of these things, and this influences the thinking, the programmatic liberalism of a variety of political leaders. Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and very much the jurisprudence of the US Supreme Court, I think, which is the main thing I'm talking about here tonight. The court especially is seen as a body that can be in the vanguard of history, keep moving history forward by reconfiguring the Constitution to allow new developments, right? So this new social science is indebted to Darwin and Darwinism, which rejects old modes and orders. And Dewey, by the time Dewey's writing in the early 20th century, he's abstracting from the thought of a lot of people influenced by this Darwinism. William Graham Sumner, Lester Frank Ward, Webb Du Bois. There are many important intellectuals of the day who are influenced by this. And their intellectual categories, I would say, continue to exert a very powerful control over political and jurisprudential discourse to this day, pointing to society as an organism constantly in the throes of change that has to, what, grow or die, keep moving forward or die, right, stagnate. And if you look backward to any standard of political right or guidance, and what could be more backwards than an 18th century constitution, if you look backwards, you're going to stagnate, you're going to die, right? You're not going to be keeping up with the times. Change itself becomes a kind of end. Dewey says the publication of The Origin of Species, Darwin's most famous work, of course, marked a revolution not only in the natural sciences but the human sciences. Only prejudice stands in the way of the brave new world of evolutionary constitutional change. Darwin, more than anyone else, allows us to move from old questions that have lost their vital appeal. Dewey says, and I'll give you another quote, "We do not solve old questions, we get over them. Old questions are solved by disappearing, evaporating, while new questions corresponding to changed attitude and preference take their place." And the greatest dissolvent of old views, old fogey views, right? Old constitutional views, old views about anything in the political and moral order. The greatest precipitant of new methods, new intentions, new problems is the one affected by the scientific revolution that found its climax in The Origin of Species, Dewey says. So it's quite striking the extent to which the intellectual classes adopt this new purportedly scientific paradigm and start applying it to everything. Dewey says Darwin lays hands on the sacred arc of permanency that had defined the Western tradition, right from the Greeks, the sense of the superiority of the fixed and the final, refracted through Christian understanding, right? Refracted through revelation, the superiority of the things that do not change, right? God himself. Everything now is changeable. This Darwinism also turns out to be an attack on traditional religion as well as traditional political, moral, constitutional understandings. The Greeks tended, Dewey says, to hold things within the metes and bounds of fixed truth. We don't do that anymore. We don't believe in fixed truths anymore. This is the new age. Henceforth, under the influence of Darwin, genetic and experimental processes guide us. Change becomes the essence of the good. It's worth mentioning that the progressivism I'm trying to capture here, sort of enucleate for you, is not the progressivism of American history books, exactly. That is to say, progressivism as what, a merely political or social movement, having to do with labor conditions or something like that. That's not the progressivism I'm talking about. I mean progressivism as an intellectual movement, this set of intellectual attachments that I've been describing, this set of insights into human nature, or really the denial of a fixed human nature and state, society, history itself, the belief that truth is always and everywhere relative to its time and place, and you need some smart people to keep history moving forward, right? To keep guiding it. And if the rustics, the people, want to stand in the way of that, Woodrow Wilson actually uses the phrase rustics to describe the people. It's like rustics handling delicate machinery when the people try to stand in the way of the necessary progress of government. They have to be overcome. And many of the great progressive thinkers, including especially Woodrow Wilson, were rather explicitly contemptuous of the American constitutional order. I'm not reading between the lines here. They tell you the Constitution stands in the way of going where we need to go. They're very open about it. Wilson is the only person to be elected president that I can think of who explicitly argued for constitutional revolution at some point in his career. I mean, people who run for president now, they all embrace they don't mean the same thing by it, but at least they rhetorically embrace the Constitution, right? And most of them then start making things up about the Constitution, but none of them say, I want to overturn the Constitution. That's not a politically winning strategy. Woodrow Wilson in his early life was before he was a politician, was very explicit about replacing the Constitution with a different kind of constitutional system. Because the Constitution, he says, embodies Newtonian mechanical ideas that stand in the way of what? Growth, change. Newtonian mechanisms, like the laws of physics or something, which constrain, right? Instead, what we need are, guess what? Darwinian organic principles, he says, right? Principles of change. So Wilson advocates, modified at various points in his life, either a modified parliamentary system or in a more diluted version of this, which is strong executive leadership, right? The president being the dominant player in the system and just being able to speak over the heads of Congress and get things done, keep things moving forward, keep the Constitution evolving as it should. Well, Wilson's reform ideas are at best partially successful. Because of what? Ineradicable constitutional limits. Presidents have proved not quite powerful enough, and they're often too beholden to populist sentiments that themselves reflect outmoded views of politics, right? Presidents can be beholden to presidents can be beholden to the rustics, the deplorables, whatever we call them nowadays, right? And so they can stand in the way of progressive change sometimes. So concentrating executive power isn't a comprehensive solution to this problem of keeping things moving forward. So what do we need? Judicial power, right? Because what can, in effect, speaking in the name of the Constitution, but really changing the Constitution, what branch can really do that without the consent of the people, right? So the progressives start to put their eggs in the judicial basket around the middle of the 20th century. By the way, who's the first and foremost jurist that you can think of who operated fully within this new model of interpretation, this Darwinian pragmatic experimental model? Any guesses here? Anyone know a little Supreme Court history? Any educated or uneducated? I'll take an uneducated guess. Who do you think is the first it's a pretty famous Supreme Court justice, actually.
Earl Warren.
Not a bad guess, but I'm going back before that. Yeah.
Holmes?
Oliver Wendell Holmes is the one I'm thinking of, right? Earl Warren, because a kind of watered down, can be viewed maybe as a watered down version of Holmes, at least in some respects, but Holmes is the first one who fully sort of embraces this historical or organic understanding of the state, this organic living constitutionalism. And the debts aren't only to progressivism, aren't only to Holmes, though. Other prominent jurists, even today, talk this language, and I'll mention I'll give a couple of examples of Supreme Court cases in a minute, but a contemporary federal judge and author, Richard Posner, some of you might have heard of him, actually says this: Darwin undermines the orthodox philosophic tradition of Platonism. Judges should be good, sort of experimental Darwinists and moving things forward. The judicial process, like the evolutionary process, is always trying to further the best variants of social and jurisprudential growth. So, that's some intellectual background, some intellectual archaeology. Let me just take a moment to emphasize or re-emphasize something that's been embedded in what I've said. That is to say, this is a radical theoretical break with the Constitution of the Founders, right? Because this view of history with a capital H grows out of the late 19th century doctrines of Darwinism and pragmatism, it is in fact alien in an obvious way to the Founders' constitutional order, right? These doctrines postdate the Founders. Progressive jurisprudence nowadays has rhetorically largely divorced itself from these Darwinian roots, right? Judges don't explicitly speak in this language very often. Posner does, even some of them do, though. Posner I just quoted, but most of them don't. But I would say generally the progressive synthesis is rarely, if ever, identified, or if it's identified, it's not recognized for what it is, something deeply and ineradicably hostile to the Founders' Constitution. And because of this hostility, progressivism as legal theory can't quite claim legitimacy in the eyes of the American people. A lot of people are suspicious about this. They're worried about, especially in presidential elections, worried about things like who's going to be on the court, and is it going to be an originalist justice or a non-originalist, an evolutionary living constitution justice, right? It doesn't quite claim legitimacy. I think in many judicial chambers, progressivism is an unstated or even unrecognized ground of constitutional interpretation, and sometimes when it does rear its head, it's cloaked in the robes of traditional judging, common law judging, traditional legal formalism, but it's not rooted in these things. So I'll give you a quick list of, to sum up what I've said so far. When I was a student, I liked lists. I found lists useful. I'm going to give you a list, okay, to sum up what I've said. On the foundations laid by the Darwinists and pragmatists, many of the most influential American political theorists, thinkers, political actors, jurists from the 19th century onward came to share 6 overlapping understandings of the nature of politics and the nature of constitutional government. The first one is no eternal principles that govern or ought to govern the politics of a decent regime. Old political categories are just that. They're just old. Secondly, the state and its parts, component parts, are organic, each involved in what? This kind of a struggle for never-ending growth. There's no Platonic idea of stasis or keeping things the same, but just growth, growth, growth. Thirdly, democratic openness, experimentalism, especially in the expressive realm, are necessary to ensure this growth. They're sort of the fertilizer of the organic state, if you will. Keep experimenting. Fourthly, the state and its organic parts exist only in history, with a capital H, right? That is to say, history not looking back, but history is going somewhere, a philosophy of history, a forward motion of history rather than a record of events. Fifth, and this is very important, some individuals stand outside this historical process, right? Some individuals, as it were, look down on it, understand it, and know how to direct it, right? The experts, I always say, especially wearing a tweed jacket, the smart people wearing tweed jackets will tell the rustics where history's going and help, history to get there, right? They adjust, and Wilson uses this metaphor explicitly. They're in a position, they're like captains of a ship, adjusting the ship in the river of time, right? If a ship is going down a river, as opposed to an ocean, you can't just navigate by the stars. You gotta see where the river's going. You know where the river's going. You kind of know where history is going. In other words, the captain of the ship makes sure it doesn't go aground, sometimes clears blockages, right? That's the idea of the expert class, keeping things moving down the river. Politics demands this elite class springing into action to make sure the ship of history doesn't run aground, right? And you've heard people talk in terms of the arc of history. They're usually arguing for some progressive project. Well, the arc of history is bending this way or that way, right? The ship is going in this direction, right? Anachronistic, what are the blockages in politics? They're not rocks, they're anachronistic laws, social practices, things people believe that have to be overcome, that have to be crushed to make way for the new progressive dispensation. And finally, in a direct corollary of this historicism is moral political truth or rightness of action is always and everywhere relative to one's moment in history, or to continue the metaphor, the exact position of the ship in the river of history, how far down the channel it is, which direction it's pointing in. The older political science of the founding era, of the Federalist, with its conception of limited, separated powers, is easily swept aside with this new, purportedly scientific understanding of politics. Okay, so are you down with everything I've said so far? Are you down with this? Are you all the way down, or just a little bit of the way down?
Ship sinking.
Ship sinking. Okay, this is my next question. On a scale of 0 to 10, I ask my students this all the time. 0 being metaphysical muddlitude, 10 being crystal clarity. Where does all this stand?
An 8.
Give me a number. An 8? Wrong.
Your talk or the concepts you talk about?
Yeah. Clarification, please. So 0.
Both. What I've 0. Wrong. Where does this stand? What's the right answer to this? What I've said so far. Where does it stand? A scale of metaphysical muddlitude to crystal clarity. Where is this? What is it? What's 0 to 10? What is it? The answer is 8.5. Why is that? Because if it's less than 8.5, it means I'm not a very good teacher. I'm a little bit insulted, hurt even. I'm a sensitive guy. And if you think it's more than 8.5, though, for those of you who don't think it's 10, you're full of hubris. If you're hearing these things for the first time, it's a little bit slippery, right? You need to think about this. So don't think it's a 10, but for some people, is it an 8.473? Does anyone think it's an 8.473? You can ask a question if you do, okay, at this point, but you can ask questions at the end, okay.
Yeah, we thought this was integers, not...
Yeah. But it's 8.5. You understand why it's 8? The answer is always 8.5. My course evaluations, by the way, students always say, this course ranks an 8.5. I'm sure the people who look at these don't get the reference. It's kind of an in-joke, right? And probably the higher-ups are wondering, why doesn't Watson get a 10 or a 9 sometimes? It's always 8.5. Because I tell them the answer is always 8.5. But it shouldn't be perfectly clear, right? These are slippery concepts. I'm laying out the intellectual archaeology. You need to think about these things, and then we'll sort of... I'll give you some examples to clarify this now, and then you can ask some questions. And this is kind of the third part of my talk, the enduring implications of progressivism, living constitutionalism on American jurisprudence, okay? I want to claim that these 6 core principles actually account for something, right? When it comes to the nature of politics, constitutional government, we can derive something from them. And I think they're particularly important with respect to hot-button cultural issues, right? Abortion, homosexuality, assisted suicide, crime and punishment, so forth. These hot-button questions, they're particularly clarifying when it comes to these things. I wouldn't, of course, claim they account for everything, but they account for a lot from people on the supposed left and right, Democratic, Republican, from, the early progressives, William Graham Sumner on the right, Lester Frank Ward on the left, John Dewey, Teddy Roosevelt, Webb Du Bois, Woodrow Wilson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Brandeis, Thurgood Marshall, John Paul Stevens, Anthony Kennedy, the recently retired Anthony Kennedy, right? For example, by the early 1990s, the plurality opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court in the famous Casey case, some of you aware of the Planned Parenthood versus Casey case? Okay. Famously asserts or reasserts an individual right to be free from unwanted governmental intrusion into matters so fundamentally affecting a person as the decision whether or not to bear or beget a child. And the decision goes on to add that, the famous lines, intimate and personal choice is central to personal dignity and autonomy. We get a line of, dignitarian jurisprudence growing out of this. Are at the heart of the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, of the mystery of human life, which define the attributes of personhood. The famous mystery clause, right? We can keep redefining and redefining human life, right? And the court's going to help us do that by preserving this purported constitutional right to abortion. And this language gets affirmed about a decade later by Justice Kennedy, writing for the majority in Lawrence v. Texas. This was a homosexuality case, where he asserts the importance of the emerging recognition of new rights, he says, worthy of judicial protection. In all events, he claims, we think our laws and traditions in the past half-century are of the most relevance here. So he's telling you, right on the surface, I'm not going to go to a lot of work to interpret what I think the Founders' Constitution actually means as it was drafted and ratified. I'm going to base my decision on what's been going on the last 50 years, he says, right? What we think right now, in the church of the here and now, as it were, right? So explicitly not referring to the Founders or the Constitution as they would have understood it, the language of emerging recognition and changing views of things. And he says this, and I'll give you a quote, had those who drew and ratified the due process clauses of the 5th Amendment or the 14th Amendment known the components of liberty in its manifold possibilities, they might have been more specific. In other words, if they knew what we knew now, they wouldn't have drafted it the way they did. So I'll redraft it for them, right? And this is not, I'm not digging deep under the surface here. He's telling you this is what I'm doing, right? I'm going to redraft this in the way that we need to understand it today. He says, generations can redefine the Constitution. The Constitution endures. Persons in every generation can invoke its principles in their own search for greater freedom. Now, whatever you think about these questions, one concerning abortion, the other homosexuality, as a kind of policy matter or matter for public disputation and changing laws and something, what I'm asking is whether this is a legitimate ground for constitutional interpretation. This ultimately culminates in the Obergefell decision, which redefines the word marriage, thus completely divorcing marriage from all its traditional and natural significations. Does that make sense as a matter of constitutional interpretation as opposed to a policy debate where the consensual input of people can be involved, right? And again, this is based on this interlocking understanding of constitutionalism and this dynamic of historical unfolding. You get this theory adopted explicitly by Supreme Court justices, not even in the course of their judgments, but just writing theoretically about the Constitution. One of the most famous progressive justices of the middle part of the 20th century was William Brennan. Some of you might have heard of him if you study the Constitution. He claims judges recognize the genius of the Constitution rests not in a static meaning, in a world that is dead and gone, his language, world that is dead and gone, but in the adaptability of its great principles to cope with current problems and current needs. A very Darwinian concept. Our adaptability will adapt the Constitution to keep up with the times. The vision of our time, he says, is destined to be different from the visions of other times, and therefore judges are no longer interpreters, but what? Visionaries, right? They will interpret what the vision of the times is and apply it to the Constitution. Again, he's coming out and saying it. I'm not reading between any lines here. A judge eschews a technical understanding of the organs of government. Again, his words, as Supreme Court Justice. Let's not get too technical about this. Right? Throw that out and find out what the vision of our times are. And he asserts again that individual dignity is important and will be the arbiters of what dignity means. And a corollary of this, I'll point out, is the scope and power of government. I don't know if this was in my list of 6 things, so there's a 7th thing in my list, really. The scope and power of government, state, national, legislative, executive, and especially judicial, are in principle unlimited. We need somebody to keep reinterpreting things to keep up with the times, right? He had a colleague, his colleague in arms on the court was the late Justice Thurgood Marshall, who also pointedly claimed the meaning of the Constitution was not fixed in Philadelphia or anywhere else. Not fixed. The Constitution was a product of its times, and it's up to the judges now to keep interpreting it and reinterpreting it. Not through the amendment, the formal amendment mechanism of the Constitution, of course. But this is what the Supreme Court does every June. You know, in June, when the decisions come down, people wait breathlessly for the next decision. When I'm waiting for this, I'm not just waiting for the decision. I'm asking myself, how is the Supreme Court going to amend the Constitution this year? Right? That is not a healthy thing in a constitutional republic. An extra legal, extra constitutional amendment mechanism. They claim they're only interpreting it, but I don't think anyone really believes that, left or right. Right? Everyone knows they're making up some view of the Constitution. Marshall, to go back to Marshall, says the constitutional text lies dead in a vault in the National Archives. It's this interesting historical curiosity, preserved in amber or whatever it's preserved in the National Archives. It's up to the judges now, right, to give it life, evolutionary life. And on some questions, history moves very, very rapidly, of course. Justice Stevens in the Boy Scouts case refers to things that have to be overcome, sectarian doctrine, atavistic opinions, habit rather than analysis. I think he's talking there, as far as I can tell, about the teachings of the Catholic Church and maybe certain Protestant ones as well. But these things have to be overcome so we can have a new understanding of things. I won't torture you with too many examples, but we'll give it another couple of examples from so-called right-to-die cases. There's an interesting line of right-to-die cases, either refusal of medical treatment or assisted suicide cases sometimes. Justice on the court, then he was appointed by a Republican, Justice Souter, but he turned out to be one of the most progressive justices on the court, repeatedly used language such as this. What we're deciding now is only for this time, right? He's willing to allow certain deference to legislative judgments, legislative restrictions on the right to die for this time. But he says, only for this time, we could look at this again. We'll see if history changes, right? We'll see if, whatever he means by history, public opinion, their sense of things changes, and then we'll revisit it. And so judicial intervention, in other words, isn't called for until it is. And we, the judges, will be the arbiters of when history has moved to this point when we get a new judicial interpretation. Other areas where you find this explicitly historicist, progressive language running through jurisprudence, I think, is when it comes to Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment in particular. Justice Kennedy was famous for this. There's a case, Kennedy versus Louisiana, the Kennedy in the case not being Justice Kennedy, but another Kennedy, which was a determining the circumstances on where the death penalty could be applied, which had, in Justice Kennedy's view, nothing to do with the text or tradition of the Constitution, but his sense of where, you know, the social consensus was on the death penalty. In this case, it was saying the death penalty couldn't be applied to childhood rape. And the circumstances of this case are particularly horrific. I mean, you can't even recount them, but if you have the stomach for it, look at the facts of Kennedy versus Louisiana. But Justice Kennedy says, oh, the Eighth Amendment now precludes that, no death penalty for child rape. The foundations of morality and politics for progressives, I think, rest not so much on the Constitution or some understanding of human nature, but in the unfolding of history and rational will. Time corrects all errors, a famous Supreme Court justice says. The future takes care of itself. We don't want to look back to musty, dusty historical documents or try to recapture their meaning, because we're now fully evolutionary, pragmatic. in our thinking? Is this becoming clearer now? Is it becoming closer to 8.5? Is it? Is it?
We're there.
Okay, we're there. Okay, good. And I think you need a philosophy of history for this. This is not a traditional theory of common law judging or constitutional interpretation. It's based on a philosophy of history. American elites, and these are going to be my closing remarks, I promise you. American elites, I think, have imbibed not merely progressivism, but in the extremity of the moment, a contemporary form of nominalism. Words have come to mean what the smart people in power think they should mean, based on our historically revealed preferences. It's becoming more like 1984, the power to define words, as it were. Courts feel free not simply to twist or ignore the meaning of words in political documents like constitutions, but the words in the Oxford English Dictionary. The redefinition of marriage is a classic example of that. With this, I think the brave new world begins. There's literally no constraint on the power of state actors by the manipulation of language to attempt to make us think as they please. I think a written constitution is no longer antecedent to anything. Written constitutionalism, I would say, is an impossibility to the extent progressive jurisprudence dominates. What's the point of a written constitution? It's to fix things. To say, this is what we agree to. Until it is formally amended, at least, this is how we will do things. It's not to license, it's not an empty vessel into which we can pour our contemporary preferences, but progressive jurisprudence makes it exactly that. So I think we live at the end of a long procession of progressivism, as I say, that seeks not so much victory, it's won its major victories, and I think we'll win more, probably. Not so much victory, but legitimation, because it's, after all, the defect or glory of the American people that they still look backward to their pre-modern Constitution, their founders, their Constitution. Lincoln's words still resonate, I think, for a lot of people. Their founding documents, their institutions, their founders live on in naked, deathless splendor. Alas, the courts and the legal professoriate have the guns, but the people have the numbers. So the standoff continues, and I think it remains to be seen whether either side will stand down. Thank you.
I'll just allow you to call on whoever
Okay,
you'd like.
I will
Does
call.
sound
That sounds
and
perfectly.
You can acknowledge by raising your hand.
I will. I am an expert at acknowledging and soliciting questions. Okay, we'll start there.
So, I mean, I don't know if you've read Senator Mike Lee's book, Our Lost Constitution. But
I have not read it, but you can. I'll trust whatever you say about it.
Well, I'm not gonna
Okay,
quote too
okay.
much from it. I'm just gonna kind of. He's echoing quite a bit of what, or I suppose you're echoing what he's saying.
No, he would be echoing what I'm saying. But anyway,
First, but sure.
politicians echo people like me. It doesn't work the other way around. Okay, go. Yeah. Okay.
But he.
Well, if we're lucky, we like to think they do, but they usually don't. Anyway.
Well, what I'm getting from both his book and from what you're
Yeah.
saying is that, you know, in technical terms, we're screwed, and America is kind of not what it was and never will be again.
Mm-hmm.
And as a constitutional conservative, I mean, I'm pretty bummed about that. So I guess
You're bummed. Okay. That's a good place to start.
yeah. And I'm wondering, like, what do you have a
Yes.
solution?
Yes. Of course. Yes. Good question. That's you're in
I
keen
wanted it,
competition
so.
for. So do I have a solution to this? Well, one of the things, the first step, of course, is to recognize there's a problem for the reasons I've given, and what the nature of the problem is, which I've tried to lay out. To have some understanding of this as an intellectual phenomenon. In other words, it's not just something that came along one day. Oh, I don't know when. Donald Trump was president if you don't like Trump, or Barack Obama was president if you don't like Obama, or if you remember back to the 1980s, the Bork nomination. It's not something that just came along at that time. This has been building for a long time. It's a major shift in political understanding. So it's a big problem, and to tackle big problems like that, you need to understand the depth of them, right? And if I'm right, this is a deep problem, and it requires radical countermeasures, right? So I'll give you, that's That's the groundwork. Now I'll give you a radical countermeasure. I think, and I've argued for, and lawyers hate me for this, because lawyers get really uncomfortable when you start talking this language. I think at some point, and that point is coming very soon, we need what I call constitutional resistance to patently unconstitutional Supreme Court decisions. Constitutional resistance can take a number of forms. The most obvious form is executive non-enforcement of outrageous judicial decisions. So the Supreme Court rules on something outrageous, and these things, by the way, they're not done by unanimous courts. It's always like one person. It's 5-4 judgment. It's always like one person in America gets to decide this, right? At some point, we need someone, probably a president, could even be a governor, but probably a president, who says, that's an interesting decision of the Supreme Court, isn't it? But it's also wrong, and I'm going to do nothing to enforce it. So if you want to enforce that decision, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, get out there and you go to wherever you need to go and you enforce that decision. I'm going to do nothing as the Chief Executive of the United States, if it involves federal law, let's say. That's radical. Lawyers don't like that. They get really uncomfortable because this seems to blow up the whole notion in their minds of rule of law. And that. But if I'm right in how I've described it, we don't exist now in a system of rule of law. We exist in a system where the rule of law, I started out by giving a definition of the rule of law, and it can't be the rule of man. Norms can't be altered non-consensually and contingently. This kind of radical view of historical change violates the principles of the rule of law. So you need someone who's willing and able to make the case that the rule of law is really being preserved in this instance by not enforcing a Supreme Court judgment. That's a forceful way to do it. There are other ways. I mean, there are ways Congress can do it, but that's Congress has the power in the Constitution to limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It's an explicit constitutional power. That hasn't been played with nearly as much as it should be, in my view. Constitutional amendment, of course, is the obvious solution, but given the politics of the regime, that seems highly unlikely. But that's the legitimate way to do it. But again, if I'm right in my kind of radical analysis of this, the Supreme Court is already doing that. They're just not admitting they're doing it. They're amending the Constitution every June. And the question is, wow, in my mind, how's the Supreme Court going to amend the Constitution this year? And if they're doing that, then it seems to me we, the people, acting through our relevant elected representatives, have a right to push back on that, right? And the outcome of that is not entirely certain. It's not something I would counsel routinely, right? But for particularly egregious cases, I think it's necessary. In fact, we argued there was a scholar's statement. You can look this up, get an idea of what I'm talking about. And you can quote some pretty impressive sources on this. One of the people you can quote is Abraham Lincoln. What did Lincoln do in the face of the Dred Scott decision? Before he was president, what did he say in the face of the Dred Scott decision? Famous speech on Dred Scott. If you haven't read Lincoln's speech on Dred Scott, run out after this talk and read it. You know what the Dred Scott case was about, right? Holding slaves to be proper. Lincoln says, this is so contrary to American principles and the established practices of the departments, and he lists all of these things, that we cannot accept this decision as having any precedential value in future cases. And we won't, and he didn't when he was president, right? Just no. And he says, if we do, he says this both in the speech on Dred Scott, first inaugural, if we do, we will have turned over the government of our affairs to this body. We are not a self-governing people anymore, right? So at some point, you just have to, what you say to drugs is what you say to the Supreme Court. Just say no. Because this progressive ideology, it's a drug to these people. They can't get off it. And every year they do something, and then they got to do the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. Why? Because their systems get all hyped up, and they get all the idea that they just have the right to do this. Yes, sir.
So this is a follow-up to what you just said.
Okay.
Is there an irony between the common discourse around constitutional conservatives that we want principled people in government, which would imply an enforcement of the law if it is the law, if we value ourselves as conservatives around that central idea, wouldn't an idea such as yours upset that and change conservatism all the way down the line?
Ooh, another good question. You're neck and neck now coming down the stretch. Right. So is what I'm saying contrary to the idea of the rule of law, right? In a nutshell. No. And the reason it's not is, and again, what I'm saying now, my solutions, depend on how much you buy my theoretical argument, right? What I am saying is we do not have a rule of law system, at least when it comes to these cultural hot button issues. We do in a lot of areas. I mean, the whole system is a problem. Most of the cases that come before the Supreme Court, 99% of them, whatever it is, some very high number involve, well, certainly they go through the federal courts, go through state courts, and then some of the more controversial things get to the Supreme Court. But most of the cases the judiciary deals with many of them are private law cases, contract disputes, and when there's something like a real rule of law there. Common law judges are interpreting things according to recognized principles, and they're trying to get the best result out of it. And probably usually they get it right, and maybe sometimes they get it wrong, but they're not infected by this philosophy of history, right? To the extent a case rests on this philosophy of history I'm describing, which are some, not the majority by any means, but some of the most controversial and noticed cases, which is damaging in itself because it creates this discontent, right? Most cases are so, if you're a lawyer, you know this, most cases are so boring you can barely stand it, which is why you shouldn't go to law school. Talk to me after about that too. Unless you want to be bored out of your minds. But for these really important cases that people pay attention to and feel like, wait a minute, excuse me, I thought we were a self-governing republic. Where did this come from? And the court just says something. I don't think those cases amount to a rule of law. Right? I do not think this is violated. I think the rule of law needs to be reasserted against an imperial judiciary here. And again, whether you accept that answer depends on whether you've accepted my build-up to that, right? Are we in a situation where we no longer live under a rule of law, right? And there might be reasons for disagreeing with my build-up. I think we are. I think we've passed that point quite a while ago. And now to reestablish the rule of law, we need to remind everybody, citizens, branches of government, that the Constitution itself does not turn over to any particular body of people or branch of government the final and absolute say over what constitutional meaning is. It just doesn't. That's something the Supreme Court has essentially appropriated to itself. The people have yawned for the most part. Our elected representatives have yawned. Or sometimes our elected representatives think, they don't say it, but that's a really controversial issue. Why don't I just say something like, well, the court has spoken on that, then I don't have to think about it anymore, right? It's a way of avoiding political controversy for politicians. Or, well, I'm not really going to try to do anything about that like I'm suggesting, but I'll raise a whole bunch of money and agitate on it and get myself reelected by seeming to be on the right or one side or another of this, either with my conservative base or my progressive base, and we'll agitate on it. But, we won't actually do anything. All of this is very unhealthy for our political system. I think we need to reinforce the rule of law, which revolves around, in my view, a vigorous departmentalism. That is to say, it's not just the court, but every branch, everyone who assumes office swears an oath of fealty to the Constitution. And it's time to step up to the plate and act like you mean it. And when you think the Supreme Court has got it wrong, then you push back. And that's not going to be most cases. That's not going to be 99% of the cases. That's going to be key things where there is real, enduring constitutional, moral, political, and constitutional dispute, and there's no way we should let this be settled by one person who once went to law school and now sits on a court. So that's a reassertion of the rule of law, in my view, not a abrogation of it. I've been okay. I'm going to come back. And is there anyone on this side of the room? Yes, sir. I thought I saw a hand there.
Well, I mean, just that right there, reshifting more of the authority to regulatory institutions. Do you think that, that's going to shift the imperial power over to another branch?
Sure. Something I didn't talk about was the another incident aspect of the progressive revolution in political thought is the growth of the administrative state, so-called, right? I've been talking about judicial power, but there's a whole realm of administrative power which is not, properly speaking, judicial power, although many administrative agencies now, part of the administrative state is they assume judicial power, right? They have the power to judge things and then dole out penalties. They concentrate all power. So, yeah, progressivism has many faces. One is the one of the faces is the facelessness of the administrative state, right? Most of the contact we have with government at the federal or state level or local level now is not with elected representatives, right? It's with some unaccountable bureaucracy that makes us do something or prevents us from doing something. And so our elected representatives are not so much makers of laws, they delegate large amounts of authority to these administrative bodies, and then after they've created this mess, what do? They act as ombudsman. You go to your representative, not as to say, why are you making crazy laws like this or delegating that much authority, but can you help me out because this weird bureaucracy is getting in the way, and can you send a letter from Congress or the state legislature, right? That they're ombudsmen rather than lawmakers, properly speaking. So I am in favor on that score of a much more vigorous non-delegation doctrine, or hold lawmakers responsible for making laws and not delegating it to an accountable administrative agency.
Do you think that the emphasis on diversity in demographic representation is kind of pulling us away from pursuing more responsible, quote unquote, responsible government in the legislative branch?
Say a little bit more about what you mean by diversity.
Well, I mean, like when we hear about like the Kavanaugh, or just presidency, any sort of, it's all about representation. Like, is this person match who I am?
Oh, I see what you mean.
And so the rhetoric there.
Yeah.
So could that be an antidote if we pursue that further?
If we pursue diversity, or if we don't pursue diversity on the basis that it's not relevant to. What do you say?
I mean, if you're advocating for a stronger legislative branch that actually takes responsibility for recreating laws and making them less susceptible to judiciary review, wouldn't we want stronger representation to represent kind of the will of the people?
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me answer the question this way then. Yeah. Okay. I think I see what you're getting at now. I am in favor. I'll go back because I'm mainly talking about the courts here, but I'll go back to the courts. I am in favor of much more diversity when it comes to judicial appointments. And what do I mean by diversity? Well, how about not everyone on the Supreme Court being from the same 2 law schools, for example, right? I mean, how about something like, obviously smart people. You're not getting, I don't favor diversity in the sense of appointing or electing stupid people just because they look different or think different from me. That's not a good solution, right? We need smart people in government. But there can be smart people who have different kinds of cultural perceptions and cultural paradigms if they don't, come out of very limited, milieus and, certain private prep schools and things like this. And this is not something that can be addressed exactly constitutionally, or it's not easy to address constitutionally, but it's something that a wise president or in some states, governor might take into account when thinking who should fill offices, right? People who, I wouldn't be opposed to, appointing some smart deplorables to things, right? Let's have some more deplorables. Why not? Not dumb deplorables, smart deplorables. But you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, there's a sense in which government is becoming a bit of a kind of, a certain kind of, within the constraints of our Republican system, it's becoming people sense it's becoming a little bit, aristocratic or oligarchical or something like that, right? Yeah. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed on a lot of levels. I think you're right. I don't remember.
Right over here.
Oh, over here, okay.
Yeah, so another proposed solution to the problem you've identified is the libertarian judicial engagement school of thought, that for people like Richard Epstein and Randy Barnett, which is that we should empower originalist judges to not take passive roles or defer to other branches, and that to me seems like more of an incremental course correction rather than sort of tapping the authority of the Supreme Court. Why is your solution better?
Yes, very good question. That's fancy. That's a fancy question, quoting Richard Epstein. Okay. Epstein, who claims to favor judges who will enforce classical liberalism, that is his preferred definition, or his preferred term, not libertarianism, although the difference between the two is sometimes not that clear to me, but he insists judges should interpret the Constitution in line with what he calls classical liberalism, which he in turn claims the American founders were classical liberals. Epstein is so wrong about so many things in that formulation. If you want more on this, and you can get a lot more on this, because actually Epstein and I went at it in print a couple of years ago on this very question. I reviewed his book, and he didn't like my review. And he said, Watson, you are a bad guy, and I will dress you down. And I said, you are a badder guy, and I will come right back at you. It was a little more scholarly than that, though.
Just a little, actually.
Yeah, just slightly. And at the end, it was quite testy, though. It was quite testy. There was an exchange between me and Richard Epstein in the online. There's a publication, the Claremont Review of Books, and the Claremont Institute website. Look for this: Richard Epstein, Bradley C.S. Watson. The book was The Classical Liberal Constitution, which I hated it. And the reason I hate it is, well, a number of reasons. He argues for judicial supremacy, but judicial supremacy on his terms, what he claims classical liberal terms. He also says the founders were classical liberals, which is ridiculous. The phrase wasn't even invented at the time of the founding. They didn't understand themselves to be classical liberals. What the founders were constitutional republicans. They believed in the natural right of people to govern themselves. They didn't believe in an ideology of classical liberalism. And many of the regulations that the founders would and did favor and that were routinely existed, especially at the state level at the time of the founding and for decades afterwards, were nowhere near libertarian or classical liberal. In fact, by our standards, even by my curmudgeonly standards, they were far too restrictive, right? But they were in favor of the ability of people to make laws, right, to govern themselves. And Epstein kind of, I think, wants to insist that the founders are classical liberals and that judges should embrace that and rule in the name of classical liberalism. He never gives a solid definition of classical liberalism. It seems to me to come down to the things that Richard Epstein likes in the way of, markets and so forth. And I'm not opposed to some of those things. I just don't think, as a constitution, it's not a legitimate constitutional position. And certain policy things, I think Epstein and I would agree on a lot of stuff. But if you want to give that kind of power explicitly into the hands of judges and then think they'll get it right, what makes you think they're going to get that right? Judges are like people who once went to law school. There's a case that I could have quoted Justice Scalia. It was a right to die case where he argues the Supreme Court should stand back entirely from right to die cases because what the heck do 9 members of the Supreme Court know about this vexed moral question? And the Constitution doesn't have anything to say about it. In other words, let the states legislate. We don't have anything to say about it, right? And he says, a close paraphrase, I would rather be governed by the first X number of names in the Kansas City telephone directory, the 9 members of the Supreme Court, or the first 9 names in the Kansas City telephone directory, right? When it comes to these questions. In other words, the sense of the people is at least as good as the sense of these fancy pants guys who sit on the Supreme Court, right? Why isn't it? This is not a constitutional, it's not a legal question. My attitude with respect to classical liberalism is the same thing. I would trust your judgments on the meaning of classical liberalism and the best way to get to an optimal economy and free society just as much, because that's a policy question, just as much as I will trust 4 people who went to Harvard, 4 people who went to Yale, and 1 who went to Columbia, right? Law school. So I think Epstein is just wrong at a lot of levels, but there's an extended exchange in this online that you can come back to.
So it wasn't necessarily on the particular ideology, but on the role of judges.
Yeah,
so
no.
You want a much lesser role. Like, what would be your ideal role of judges? Because if you'd rather have the people decide, why even have a Supreme Court?
I don't trust the judges. So you need a Supreme Court for the reasons I think that was given in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton, one of the great defender of the court, gives some example. You can have conflicting laws. You have conflicting federal versus state laws, or conflicting federal laws. And he gives examples of things that are explicitly in the Constitution. That what if a legislature passes an ex post facto law? Then you need a court to say, well, the Constitution says that no ex post facto laws, and this weird legislation meets the definition of ex post facto law, or no bills of attainder, right? Courts do things where, in other words, his examples, this vigorous defender of the court at the time of the founding, his examples are actually examples about things that appear in so many words explicitly in the Constitution. Nowhere does even Hamilton, the vigorous defender of the federal judiciary, claim that, courts one day could invent a right of privacy, and that would be okay because we really need a strong judiciary. He's not talking about anything, he's not contemplating anything like that. The underlying assumption, what's in the water, is that these courts will operate as common law courts. The American Revolution is an interesting thing. A big part of the American Revolution, when you think about it, is we demand our independence from these tyrants so that we may maintain the English legal system. True story. The American Revolution is very conservative. They thought the rights embedded in the long history of English common law were being denied the nobles, right? The embedded assumption is courts, I think the embedded assumption is courts are going to behave as common law courts do. They're going to do things of a properly judicial nature. They're going to apply common law interpretive principles, common law remedies for injustices or violations of law, or sometimes, direct conflict of laws, things of this nature. Things that common law courts had long done, or interpret the meaning of, is the right of habeas corpus being abided by in this case, right? No one at the time of the founding, even the vigorous defenders of the court, I think, are imagining that we will no longer live in a world where we have common law courts, but we have not so much courts of law, courts of what used to be called law. We now have something which the founders considered and rejected, a council of revision, right? A super body that gets to second guess the laws that Congress passes. So I don't want courts as a council of revision. And as soon as you give judges a license to say, define what classical liberalism is, that's a council of revision. That's not a court anymore. Who's going to agree on what classical liberalism is? And if they do, it's going to be something really weird. It's going to be weird. I'd rather trust the first 9 names in the Boise telephone directory to define that for me. Now, I'm not saying the 9 names will get it right, but I'm also not saying the 9 justices of the Supreme Court are going to get it right? I mean, I guess people get things wrong, but to turn over self-government for the chance that judges might get it right sometimes seems to be a high-risk strategy and not one that I would adopt.
All right, well, then join me in thanking Professor Watson.
Okay. Oh boy, this is hard. I think I got to go with the guy who introduced my frenemy Epstein. Okay, I'm gonna throw this out. Can you catch it? Because my mother would flip in her grave. She'd say, "You will take somebody's eye out. I'm going to throw it. You catch it, because it's not you. It's the people behind you whose eyes are going to be taken out. Are you ready? Okay, ready? Go. Oh, okay.
That wasn't a good throw. Thank you.